The sound of a failing blowout preventer isn't a scream. It's a deep hydraulic moan that you feel in your chest cavity before the alarms even register the pressure drop at 2:30 p.m. On a Tuesday, that moan started echoing through the steel belly of Platform 7. I was already moving before the warning lights painted the control room red. I'm Danny Morrison, but everyone calls me Bull. 58 years old, and for the last 25 years, I've been the senior field engineer at Gulfstar Energy's offshore operations. To the corporate suits visiting from Houston, I look like a relic in steel-toed boots and a hard hat covered in rig stickers, but in reality, I'm the guardian of a beast that could level half the Gulf Coast if it decides to throw a tantrum. Zach, I shouted over the rising whine of the hydraulic pumps, grab the backup manifold kit. We've got a pressure spike on the primary BOP stack. The mud waits climbing past safe parameters. Zach Rodriguez, my 26-year-old apprentice, didn't freeze like most rookies do when the lights start flashing. Kid had been under my wing for 3 years now, and he'd learned that panic kills faster than any blowout. The control board looked like a Christmas tree having a seizure. Red lights cascading across every system monitor. Bull, the downhole pressure gauge, is reading 8,500 psi. Zach called out, his voice tight but controlled. Shouldn't we initiate emergency shutdown procedures? Not yet, I said, sliding my hands across the manual override panel. The hydraulic pressure on the BOP rams is holding steady. This is just the formation talking to us. We need to adjust the mud density and bleed off the excess pressure gradually. If we slam the emergency stop now, we'll fracture the casing and turn this into a real nightmare. I lay flat on the deck, crawling under the massive steel framework of the blowout preventer control unit. Above me, the intricate maze of high-pressure hydraulic lines hissed and groaned like a living thing. This platform was my territory. I knew every valve, every pressure rating, and every temperamental sensor by heart. Specifically, I held the Deep Water Drilling Safety Certification, Level 5. There were only 2 other people in the entire Gulf with that ticket, and both were sitting behind desks in corporate offices, probably hadn't touched real equipment in a decade. I reached up with my torque wrench, feeling for the manual pressure relief valve. The steel was hot, scorching hot from the friction of high-pressure drilling mud racing through the lines. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the burns seeping through my work gloves. This was surgery performed with a 40-pound wrench while lying on a steel deck that pitched and rolled with every wave. Bull, we've got company, Zach hissed, tapping my boot with his steel toe. I didn't stop working. Not now, kid. Almost got this pressure balanced. Mr. Morrison. A voice cut through the mechanical noise, but it wasn't the urgent tone of a driller or the concerned call of a safety inspector. It was the polished, irritated drawl of someone whose hands had never been dirty and whose biggest worry was quarterly earnings reports. I gave the relief valve one final quarter turn. The hydraulic moan dropped an octave, the pressure reading sliding back into the green zone. The beast was pacified, at least for now. I slid out from under the BOP control unit, wiping hydraulic fluid from my forehead with a rag that had seen better days. My knees popped as I stood up, vertebrae protesting after 3 decades of crawling under heavy machinery. Standing in front of me was Brandon Phillips, the new efficiency director Gulfstar had brought in from some consulting firm back east. He'd been on the platform for exactly 2 weeks, and in that time he'd managed to piss off every department head from the galley to the drill floor. He stood there in a spotless hard hat that still had the manufacturer's sticker on it, checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be than watching me prevent a potential disaster. "Is there a problem, Mr. Phillips?" I asked, still breathing hard from the exertion and adrenaline. "The problem, Bull," he said, looking at the hydraulic fluid on my hands with the same expression most people reserve for roadkill, "is that every time I come out here, you're lying on the deck. This is a precision drilling operation, not some backyard mechanic shop." I adjusted my hard hat, a habit I'd developed over the years when my patience was running thin. The adrenaline from bringing the BOP back into safe parameters was still coursing through my system. I was calibrating the pressure relief system, I explained. If I hadn't done that, the blowout preventer would have failed catastrophically. You would have lost the well and probably the platform. Phillips laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the dry, condescending sound of someone who thought experience was just another line item on a spreadsheet. "Always the drama with you field guys. Critical this, catastrophic that. It's all theater to justify your overtime hours and inflated salary. I've looked at the maintenance logs, Bull. You spend 4 hours a day on so-called preventive inspections. You know what I call that? Inefficiency. Zach stepped forward, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Sir, Bull is the only person on this platform who knows how to properly calibrate the deep water systems. Without his inspections, that's enough. Phillips snapped, not even looking at the kid. He kept his eyes locked on me like a hunter sizing up his prey. I was brought here to eliminate waste and increase profitability. And Bull, looking at your salary compared to your actual output, you're the definition of dead weight. The alarms on the wall had finally gone quiet, transitioning to a steady green glow that meant all systems were back within normal parameters. I had just prevented what could have been a multi-million-dollar disaster, and this spreadsheet jockey was looking at me like I'd just stolen his lunch money. The silence that follows an emergency reset on an offshore platform usually has weight to it, filled with the collective exhale of 30-some crew members who just dodged a bullet. But this silence felt different. It felt like the moment before lightning strikes. I wiped my hands slowly on the rag, buying time to think. I dealt with corporate efficiency experts before. Bean counters who thought the real world operated like their PowerPoint presentations. Usually you could throw some technical jargon at them, mention a few regulations, and they'd retreat to their air-conditioned offices and leave you alone to do your job. Mr. Phillips, I said, keeping my voice level despite the fire building in my gut. I understand you have numbers to hit, but this equipment is 20 years old and operates in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The preventive inspections you see logged aren't busy work. They're me manually checking pressure seals, hydraulic fluid levels, and valve responses that keep 32 people from dying if something goes wrong. If I stop doing them, critical systems fail. If critical systems fail, people die. Phillips smirked, shaking his head like he was explaining basic math to a particularly slow child. See, that's exactly the attitude I'm talking about. You think you're indispensable? You think because you've been out here since this platform was built that you own the place? Well, you don't. This is a business, not a charity for aging roughnecks. I've already ordered new automated monitoring systems. Phillips continued, pulling a tablet from his briefcase, like he was revealing some kind of magic wand. They'll be installed next week. Digital sensors, real-time data feeds, artificial intelligence algorithms that can predict equipment failures before they happen. We won't need someone crawling around on their belly playing mechanic anymore. Those automated systems won't interface with the legacy hydraulic controls on the BOP stack, I said, my voice dropping to the tone I used to use with fresh Marines who thought they knew better than their drill instructor. I wrote a technical assessment on this exact issue last month. Did you read it? Phillips's face flushed red above his starched collar. He took a step closer, invading my personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never been punched in the mouth for overstepping. Bull, I don't need to read technical reports from a wrench turner to understand operational efficiency. I need employees who follow directives and adapt to modern technology. You were lying on the deck during peak drilling operations, interfering with automated systems. I was preventing a blowout. I shot back, my patience finally starting to crack like a pressure seal under too much stress. You were napping, Phillips shouted, his voice echoing off the steel walls and drawing stares from the crew working nearby. In my assessment, that constitutes gross negligence and insubordination. The accusation hung in the salt air like the smell of burning hydraulic fluid. Zach's mouth fell open. Two roughnecks operating the pipe handler stopped what they were doing to watch. The constant background noise of drilling operations seemed to fade as every man on the platform tuned in to what was happening. You're firing me. I asked, the reality of the situation hitting me like a rogue wave. I am terminating your employment for cause, Phillips declared, straightening his tie with the satisfaction of a man who just won what he thought was a chess match. Gross negligence, wasting company resources, insubordination, and failure to adapt to modern operational procedures. You represent everything backward about this industry, Bull. You're a liability that Gulf Star Energy can no longer afford. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, the papers already prepared and signed. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision based on what he'd just witnessed. This was a planned execution, and he'd come out here today specifically to pull the trigger. The confrontation over the BOP repairs was just theater, an excuse to justify a decision he'd already made in some climate-controlled boardroom back in Houston. Hand over your hard hat, your safety equipment, and your access cards, Phillips said, extending a manicured hand that had probably never held anything heavier than a coffee cup. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the arrogance, the complete ignorance of the forces he was playing with. The dangerous confidence of someone who thought spreadsheets could override physics. And then something strange happened. A calm settled over me like the eye of a hurricane. If I fought this, if I argued and pleaded, I might buy myself another month or two. But he'd make my life hell, question every decision I made, second guess every safety protocol I followed. And eventually something would break that I wouldn't be allowed to fix, and good people would pay the price for his ignorance. But if I walked away now, let him learn the hard way what happens when you remove the only person who truly understands the beast. All right, I said quietly. Phillips blinked, clearly surprised by the lack of resistance. He'd probably expected me to beg, to grovel, to promise to be a good little employee who followed orders without question. All right, you're the boss, I repeated, unclipping my Gulfstar ID badge from my coveralls. I removed the master keyring from my belt, the one with access to the emergency shutdown controls, the pressure relief systems, and the manual backup overrides for every critical system on the platform. The keys were heavier than they looked. Phillips's hand dipped when I dropped them into his palm. You know, I said, leaning in close enough that only he could hear me over the drilling noise. The backup hydraulic accumulator on the BOP stack needs to be recharged every 18 hours. If you don't maintain that pressure, the emergency seals won't engage if you get a kick from the formation. The hydraulic fluid gets contaminated with seawater, turns into sludge, and clogs the relief valves. Phillips sneered, pocketing the keys like they were loose change. We have maintenance manuals for all of that. We don't need folklore and superstition anymore. Clear out your personal effects. You have 30 minutes to get off this platform. I looked over at Zach. The kid looked like someone had just told him his dog died. His hands were shaking slightly, and I could see him struggling with whether to speak up, knowing that his own job was probably hanging by a thread. Watch the pressure gauges, kid, I whispered to him as I walked past. And when the needle starts climbing into the red zone, don't be a hero. Get yourself and the crew to the lifeboats. My quarters were in the accommodation block, a small metal box that had been home for half of every month for the past 25 years. The walls were covered with certificates from safety training courses, photos from successful well completions, and a few personal pictures. There was one of my late wife, Sarah, at our daughter Amanda's law school graduation, and another of me and my Marine unit in Afghanistan before everything went to hell. I packed my personal toolkit into a duffel bag, the precision instruments I'd accumulated over a quarter century of offshore work. My personal torque wrench, calibrated to specifications that most people couldn't even pronounce. My depth gauge and my lucky multimeter, the one that had helped me diagnose a faulty pressure sensor during Hurricane Rita when the automated systems failed. Bull? I turned around. It was Pete Johnson from the union office, standing in my doorway with his hard hat in his hands. Pete was built like a concrete mixer, and had a voice that could carry over a Category 3 hurricane. He looked pale as milk. I just got the termination notice from Phillips, he said, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. Bull, I tried to tell him you're protected under the collective bargaining agreement. Master-level certifications can't be terminated without union review and a 90-day notice period. But he went straight to corporate, bypassed the whole process. It's okay, Pete, I said, closing my locker for the last time. He wants to cut costs, and I'm the highest paid field engineer on the payroll. Can't argue with the math. But who's going to handle the deep water certifications? Pete asked, his eyes wide with the kind of panic that comes from understanding the real implications. The quarterly safety inspection is next week. If those systems aren't signed off by a Level 5 certified engineer, the Coast Guard will shut us down. We'll be operating illegally. That's not my problem anymore, is it? I said, hefting the duffel bag over my shoulder. Pete looked at the bag in my hands, then back at my face. He marked you as do not rehire across the entire Gulfstar system. No severance, no benefits continuation, nothing. 25 years and you're walking away with a duffel bag. That stung worse than I wanted to admit. 25 years of missing Christmas dinners, anniversary celebrations, and my daughter's soccer games to keep drilling operations running during hurricanes and equipment failures. 25 years of putting my life on the line in one of the most dangerous industrial operations in the world. And I was walking away with nothing but a reputation as damaged goods. He can mark whatever he wants, I said, walking past Pete toward the door. He's about to learn that you can't drill for oil with an MBA and an attitude problem. I walked out onto the main deck, past the drilling floor where the crew was running pipe for the next section of hole. The familiar rhythm of offshore operations continued around me, but I could feel eyes following my movement. Word travels fast on a platform, and by now everyone knew that Bull Morrison had been terminated. The helicopter pad was at the far end of the platform, where a Gulfstar transport chopper was waiting to ferry me back to the mainland. As I approached the helipad, I stopped at the control booth where Zach was staring at the drilling parameters on his monitor. The kid looked at me through the reinforced glass, his face a mixture of confusion and fear. I nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that meant more than any words could convey. He raised his hand in a hesitant wave, and I could see him mouth the words "take care." Phillips was standing by the helicopter, arms crossed, watching to make sure I didn't steal any company property on my way out. He looked satisfied, like a man who'd just solved a complex problem by throwing money at it. "Don't worry about the coveralls," Phillips called out as I approached, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's rotors. "We'll burn them." I stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he had to tilt his head back to meet my eyes. I had 6 inches and 40 pounds on him, built solid from decades of physical work that his gym membership could never replicate. "Brandon," I said, my voice low enough that only he could hear over the mechanical noise. "The hydraulic accumulator I just serviced is operating on a temporary pressure patch. It needs a complete rebuild within 72 hours. The parts are in the equipment bay, requisition number Delta 77 Alpha. Don't try to stretch that timeline." Phillips laughed, shaking his head with the kind of condescending amusement reserved for children who still believed in fairy tales. "Pathetic. Even on your way out the door, you're trying to make yourself sound indispensable. Goodbye, Bull." I climbed into the helicopter, strapped myself into the jump seat, and watched Platform 7 shrink into the distance as we headed for shore. From 1,000 feet up, the drilling platform looked like a child's toy floating in an endless blue expanse. It was hard to believe that something so small from this altitude contained enough explosive potential to create an environmental disaster that would make the evening news for months. My house sat on 2 acres of scrub pine about 30 miles inland from the Gulf, close enough to smell the salt air when the wind was right, but far enough from the water to avoid most of the hurricane surge. It had been too quiet since Sarah passed 3 years ago, but after spending half my time on a platform surrounded by 32 other people, the solitude usually felt like a luxury. Today, it just felt empty. For 25 years, my life had been dictated by the rotation schedule: 2 weeks offshore, 2 weeks onshore. Up at 0500, helicopter at 0630, boots on deck by 0800. Now, at 1400 hours on a Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold, listening to the air conditioning cycle on and off. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd walked off the platform. Most of the calls were from guys I'd worked with over the years, word of my termination spreading through the offshore community like wildfire. I let them all go to voicemail. What was I supposed to tell them? "Yeah, Phillips fired me because he thinks experience is a liability." Then Amanda called. "Dad." Her voice was sharp with the kind of controlled anger she'd inherited from her mother. "Zach just texted me. He said security escorted you off Platform 7. What the hell is going on?" Amanda was 32, sharp as a blade, and worked as a legal advisor for a maritime law firm in New Orleans. She had my stubborn streak and Sarah's intellect, a combination that made her dangerous in a courtroom and overprotective when it came to family. "I got terminated, sweetheart," I said, taking a sip of coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through sand. Brandon Phillips decided I was too expensive and too old-fashioned for his efficiency targets. "Terminated," she practically shouted into the phone. "Dad, you are Platform 7. You wrote half the safety protocols they use out there. Did you sign any termination documents?" "No, I just handed over my equipment and left." "Good. Don't sign anything until I review it. I'm driving over." "Amanda, you have work. I'm taking a personal day." "I'm bringing lunch and my laptop. Do not answer the phone for anyone from Gulfstar until I get there." She hung up before I could argue, which was typical Amanda. She'd been taking care of me ever since Sarah died, even though I kept telling her I was fine. The truth was, having her nearby made the empty house feel less like a mausoleum. While I waited, I checked my voicemail. There were messages from Pete, from several crew members, and from Roy Davis, the security supervisor who'd known me since his first day on the platform. But the one that caught my attention was from Phillips himself. "Bull, this is Mr. Phillips. It seems you failed to provide the access codes for the digital maintenance database before your departure. This constitutes theft of company intellectual property. You need to email those codes to me immediately, or we'll pursue legal action." I almost laughed out loud. The digital maintenance database was just a spreadsheet I'd built on my own time to track equipment wear patterns and maintenance schedules. Because Gulfstar's corporate software was worse than useless for real-world applications. It wasn't company property any more than my personal toolkit was. I didn't reply to his message. Sometimes silence costs you nothing but costs them everything. 20 minutes later, Amanda's car pulled into my driveway. She didn't knock, just burst through the front door with a bag of sandwiches under one arm and her laptop case slung over her shoulder. She'd inherited her mother's ability to transform any space into a command center within minutes. "Okay," she said, setting up her workstation on my dining room table and firing up her computer. "I'm looking at your employment contract right now. They owe you 6 months severance for any termination without cause, unless they can prove gross negligence or willful misconduct. Did you break anything expensive?" "No," I said, unwrapping a sandwich that smelled like the deli Sarah used to love. "I prevented a hydraulic failure that could have caused a blowout." "So we've got wrongful termination," Amanda muttered, typing furiously. "But Dad, Zach texted me again 20 minutes ago. He says Philips ordered the automated monitoring systems installed this morning. They're planning to go live with the new setup tomorrow." I set down my sandwich. "Tomorrow? That's way ahead of schedule." "Yeah, he fast-tracked everything. Apparently he wants to prove his efficiency improvements before the quarterly board meeting next week." I closed my eyes and did some quick calculations in my head. The automated sensors would interface with the platform's computer systems, but they wouldn't be compatible with the manual override controls for the BOP stack. If something went wrong and the automated systems failed, there would be no way to manually control the blowout preventer without someone who understood how to bypass the digital lockouts. "Amanda, if those systems fail, what happens to the crew? Zach knows the basics, but he doesn't have level 5 certification. He can't legally sign off on deep water safety protocols." I was talking about emergency procedures. If the automated systems crash and the BOP stack loses hydraulic pressure, does anyone on that platform know how to manually engage the emergency seals? Amanda looked up from her laptop, her eyes reflecting the same kind of worried understanding that her mother used to get when she realized I was about to do something dangerous but necessary. "Dad, if that happens, people die." "I know," I said, standing up and walking to the window that faced toward the Gulf. "That's why I called somebody who might be able to help us do something about it." As if summoned by my words, a black Lincoln Town car pulled into my driveway, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever was inside. The engine shut off and Spencer Hayes stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket against the humid Gulf air. Spencer was a maritime attorney who specialized in offshore industrial accidents, and we'd worked together on a couple of regulatory cases over the years. He looked like he could argue a case in federal court or win a bar fight, depending on which skills the situation required. "Bull," Spencer called out, walking up the front steps with a briefcase that probably cost more than most people's cars. "You look like hell." "Retirement doesn't agree with you, Spencer," I said, shaking his hand. His grip could crack walnuts. "Thanks for coming on short notice." For the man who testified on my behalf during the Deepwater Nova inquiry, Spencer grinned, stepping into the kitchen. "I'd drive down from Dallas in the middle of a hurricane." He nodded to Amanda. "You must be the lawyer daughter, prettier and probably smarter than your old man." Amanda smiled despite herself. "Spencer Hayes. I've read your briefs on the Continental Shelf case." "Impressive work." Spencer sat down at the table and pulled out a thick legal pad. "I made some calls after you reached out, Bull. Brandon Phillips, MBA from Northwestern, track record of slashing operational costs, boosting short-term stock performance, and then moving on before the infrastructure collapses. He's what we call a strip miner. He strips assets instead of coal. He terminated me for cause," I said, "gross negligence and insubordination." Spencer's grin turned predatory. "Perfect. That means we don't just sue for wrongful termination. We go after them for defamation of character and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But first, tell me about this equipment failure you mentioned." I explained the automated sensor installation, the incompatibility with the legacy hydraulic controls, and the time-critical nature of the hydraulic accumulator maintenance that Phillips was now responsible for handling. Spencer stopped writing and looked at me with the expression of a shark that had just detected blood in the water. "Is there documentation of your warnings?" Spencer asked. "I sent a technical advisory to Phillips's email 3 weeks ago," Amanda said, spinning her laptop around to show the screen. "Dad wanted me to proofread it for clarity. Subject line: Critical Safety Advisory, Automated System Integration. Spencer's smile got even wider. Beautiful. That email is your golden parachute, Bull. It proves he was warned about the risks. It establishes negligence if something goes wrong. Now, here's what we're going to do. We wait for what? I asked. We let him install his automated systems. We let him ignore your maintenance recommendations. We let the hydraulic accumulator fail exactly the way you predicted it would. Spencer, I said, my voice dropping to the tone I'd once used with Marines who were about to do something monumentally stupid. If that accumulator fails, 32 people could die. The backup safety systems are redundant, right? Spencer asked. Multiple fail-safes, emergency shutdown procedures, Coast Guard mandated blowout preventers. The BOPs are mechanical, I confirmed. They'll engage if the hydraulic pressure drops below critical levels. It'll create a hell of a mess. Shut down operations for months. Cost Gulfstar about $50 million in lost revenue. But it shouldn't kill anyone. Good, Spencer said. Then we let him break his expensive toy. When the stock price tanks and the board is screaming for answers, we walk in with our evidence and our lawsuit. The waiting was the worst part. Thursday afternoon dragged by like a root canal performed without anesthesia. Spencer stayed for dinner, telling war stories about corporate executives who thought the laws of physics were subject to negotiation. Amanda worked on her laptop, pulling up SEC filings and financial reports on Gulfstar Energy. At 1800 hours, my phone rang. It was Zach, and I could hear the background noise of drilling operations, but something was off. The rhythm was wrong too fast, with an underlying vibration that made my teeth ache just listening to it. Answer it, Spencer commanded. Put it on speaker. I swiped the screen. Zach, this is Bull. Oh, thank God, Zach was whispering, and I could hear the barely controlled panic in his voice. Bull, he made us do it. We installed the automated sensors this morning, and they failed exactly like you said they would. Sparks, smoke, the whole 9 yards. But Phillips won't let us shut down operations. What? I stood up so fast my chair fell over. He says the sensor failure was a manufacturer defect. He ordered us to bypass the safety interlocks and run the drilling operations on manual pressure estimation. He says we can't afford to miss the production targets for this quarter. Spencer had gone pale. Amanda was staring at the phone like it might explode. Zach, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, listen to me very carefully. Running drilling operations without functional pressure sensors is like flying a plane blindfolded in a thunderstorm. You need to evacuate the platform immediately. I can't. Zach's voice cracked. He's got security posted at the helipad. He says anyone who abandons their post gets terminated for cause and loses all their benefits. Bull. The hydraulic accumulator is making noises I've never heard before. The pressure readings are all over the place. Get to the emergency lifeboat stations, I ordered. Pull the general alarm if you have to. Just get the crew away from the drill floor. The line went dead. Either Zach had hung up, or something had happened to the platform's communication systems. He's bypassing federally mandated safety systems, Spencer said, standing up and grabbing his briefcase. That's not just negligence anymore. That's criminal recklessness. We have to go. I was already reaching for my truck keys. If that accumulator fails and the automated systems can't compensate, the blowout preventer might not engage properly. We could be looking at an uncontrolled release. Amanda grabbed her laptop and followed us out the door. I'm calling the Coast Guard, she said, her fingers flying over her phone screen. Spencer drove like a man possessed, his Lincoln eating up the 40-mile distance to the Gulfstar heliport in 23 minutes. I spent the drive monitoring the emergency frequency scanner app on Amanda's phone, listening for any distress calls from Platform 7. We screeched into the heliport parking lot to find it in chaos. 2 Coast Guard helicopters were spinning up on the tarmac, emergency crews loading rescue equipment. A Gulfstar executive I didn't recognize was arguing with a Coast Guard commander, waving papers and pointing toward the Gulf. I jumped out of Spencer's car and ran toward the Coast Guard commander, a woman with captain's bars and the no-nonsense expression of someone who'd spent her career dealing with industrial emergencies. Captain, I shouted over the helicopter noise. I'm Danny Morrison, former senior field engineer for Platform 7. What's the situation? She turned to look at me, and I saw recognition in her eyes. Morrison, you wrote the emergency response protocols we use for offshore evacuations. We just lost communication with Platform 7. Last transmission indicated hydraulic system failure and possible blowout conditions. My worst fears crystallized into cold reality. How long ago? 17 minutes. We've got birds in the air, but it's a 40-minute flight time to the platform. I looked at the helicopters, then at Spencer and Amanda. 25 years of experience. All the knowledge Phillips had thrown away might be the only thing standing between 32 good people and disaster. "Captain," I said, adjusting my hard hat one last time, "I need a ride." The helicopter lifted off into the setting sun, racing toward a pillar of black smoke rising from the horizon where Platform 7 should have been. Through the headset radio, I could hear Zach's voice, weak but alive, calling for emergency assistance. The automated systems had failed exactly as I'd predicted, but the crew had managed to engage the manual blowout preventer before the situation became catastrophic. Phillips was found 2 hours later in the platform's communications room, frantically shredding documents while crude oil sprayed from a severed hydraulic line 30 feet away. The Coast Guard arrested him on charges of reckless endangerment and violation of federal maritime safety regulations. 6 months later, I was sitting in the boardroom at Gulf Star Energy's Houston headquarters, but this time I was on the other side of the table. The settlement agreement was spread out in front of Cliff Anderson, Gulf Star's CEO, who looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in the past week. "Mr. Morrison," Anderson said, signing the final page of the contract, "welcome back. Or should I say, welcome to Morrison Marine Safety Consulting." The new company was my idea, with Spencer as the legal partner and Amanda handling the business side. My consulting rate was 4 times what Gulf Star had paid me as an employee, with a clause that gave me absolute authority over all safety decisions. No corporate efficiency expert could overrule my technical assessments, no matter how much money was at stake. But the best part was the non-compete clause we'd negotiated. Any other oil company that wanted to hire Morrison Marine Safety Consulting had to agree to the same terms: complete technical autonomy, premium rates, and zero tolerance for corner cutting on safety. Phillips was last seen working as a business consultant in Ohio, his offshore career permanently grounded. The criminal charges were eventually reduced to misdemeanor reckless endangerment, but his reputation in the energy industry was destroyed. As for me, I learned that my value wasn't in my willingness to follow orders. It was in my ability to say no when saying yes could get people killed. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is remain silent when you know better. I'm writing this from the deck of my new house, built on the same 2 acres, but with a clear view of the Gulf. Amanda's inside preparing dinner, and Spencer's driving down from Dallas with a case of good bourbon and stories about the latest corporate lawsuit we're working on. The sun is setting over the water, painting the sky the color of crude oil, and somewhere out there, Platform 7 is humming along safely under the supervision of engineers who understand that respect isn't given freely. It's earned one crisis at a time by the people brave enough to stand between civilization and the chaos that's always trying to break through. They called me obsolete, but I learned that in a world obsessed with newer and faster, sometimes the most valuable thing you can be is the person who remembers how things break, and more importantly, how to fix them when they do. The invoice they refused to pay as my employee now arrives every month as my consultant fee, because the market always finds a way to correct itself and expertise doesn't become worthless just because someone with an MBA says it is.